Mike drives his friend Scott to a surprise birthday party organized by his wife Annie with his co-workers to celebrate his birthday and the contract he won for the company, and they share a toast. While having a quiet time together, he reminds her of the conversation they had about buying a house, and she tells him she still wants the house. The next morning they drive to see a house that is up for sale outside town. As they look around, they hear a gunshot, and Charlie shows up with a gun. They try to run, but he told them not to be scared and introduces himself. And as they walk into the house to look around the place, he tells them he lost his wife to cancer, and the house was built by his father. As they look around in the house, Scott sees more guns and gets uncomfortable. Charlie tells them his daughter wants him to move to Florida. That's why he wants to sell the house. After showing them around the house, he tells Scott that the house is worth $3.5 million, but he tells them they can have it for $3.3 million when they attempt to leave. On their way home, Annie convinces him to pay for the house, and he agrees. A week later they move into the house, and Charlie hands over the key to the apartment to Annie and leaves. Scott and Annie go back into the house, and they have a romantic moment. Later that night, their friends Mike and Rachel visited them, and they had a chat about their experience while coming to check out the house on the first day. After having a chat, Mike goes out to the garden to take a pee and drops a cigarette on the floor. In the morning while leaving, he sees a cigarette burn in his car upholstery and complains about it. Scott tells him to stop smoking and he drives off with Rachel. The next day while at work, Scott gets a call from Annie telling him that Charlie is outside the house cutting the grass. She goes out to meet him and asks him why he didn't leave, and he tells her he has something to take care of before leaving. Scott comes back later in the day, and she tells him she invited Charlie for Thanksgiving, and they joke about it. Charlie shows up for Thanksgiving. Scott shows him around the sitting room, and he discovers that the old painting is no longer there. Charlie asks Scott why he took it off, and he gets furious while he explains. Mike and Rachel show up also, and they all had a chat at the dining room while having a meal. Mike talks about renovating the house, and Charlie tells him they do not need to, but Mike disagrees and tells him they have to. While Scott tries to open a bottle of wine, Charlie visualizes where he smashes Mike's head with a bottle of wine. Mike goes out to take some fresh air and lights up a cigarette. Charlie joins him, and they talk and have a discussion about the sale of the house and his coming around to cut the grass. Mike discovers that it was Charlie that burned his car upholstery with the cigarette and tells everyone later that night. He tells Scott he suspects that Charlie still stays around the house, and they go out to check it out after making a bet. They see a car and go after it, but the car backs away quickly. In the morning, while Scott is setting up a CCTV and a light with some security team, Charlie shows up and tries to stop them, but Scott tells him to leave because it is his house. Later that night Scott notices the security lights come on and runs out with a baseball bat but discovers it's some teenagers but didn't see Charlie looking at him. The next day, Scott gets back with Annie and sees Charlie in the house with a gun and tells him never to bring a gun to the apartment again. Charlie shows them the Christmas light at the store and offers to help them fix it, but Scott refuses and asks him to always call or text before coming to the house. Charlie gets furious and leaves. He shows up the next day with a bottle of wine while Scott is at work, and Annie apologizes to him for the previous day. Charlie asks him if he could assist her in fixing the Christmas light, and she agrees. Later in the evening after fixing the lights, Annie invites Charlie into the house. She goes to get glasses for the wine and he makes a pass at her without her notice. While talking, she gets a message from Scott, goes to call him, and gets angry with him for sending a text. Scott gets back home, and they had a disagreement, and she tells him she will be sleeping in another room that night and leaves him. Later that night, Scott hears a sound and gets up. He sees Charlie and goes out to the sitting room and gets scared as Annie calls his name. He tries to tell her that he saw Charlie, but she tells him he might be hallucinating because of the wine he took. They apologize to each other and share a romantic moment as Charlie watches them making out. The next day, Scott goes to get a drink, and Grady Kramer, a neighbor who lives close by, approaches him and discloses to him that Charlie's wife didn't die of cancer but was shot in the house. Scott goes home and discusses it with Annie, and she tells him it might not be true since there was no evidence. He tells her that Charlie has been looking at her in a certain way and tells her to stop Charlie from coming to the house or he will do that himself. They go out and stop by the Royal Hotel, where Charlie tells them he stays, and after having a drink, he tells Charlie to leave his wife alone and stop coming back to the house. Early the next morning, while Scott is out for a walk, Charlie knocks him down with his car and drives off. Annie goes to see him in the hospital, and after staying for a while, he asks her to go home. He calls Mike the next day and tells him he suspects that it was Charlie that hit him with his car and asks him to tell Brian, the IT guy, to find out everything he can about Charlie. While Annie is having her shower at home, she hears a knock on the door and goes to check and finds Charlie, who hands her a box of pizza. He tells her he heard that Scott is in the hospital, and she asks him to join her in the house. Later that day, Mike goes to see Scott at the hospital and tells him they discovered that Charlie is into some legal problems and tells him everything they discovered. Scott tells Mike to stop by at his house to check on Annie to make sure she is fine and call him. Mike gets to the house and finds Charlie's car parked outside. He goes to look through the window and sees him talking with Annie. Charlie goes to get a bottle of wine and notices someone outside. He tells Annie that someone is watching them and goes after Mike with an axe as he runs. He catches him, and Mike apologizes for spying on him, but he kills him with the axe. Charlie goes back to the house and pretends to twist his ankle and lies to Annie that it was some kids. As Annie looks at his leg, he makes some sexual advances at her without her notice. He asks Annie if he could stay, but she tells him there is no need since it is nothing serious, and she helps him to the door as he leaves the house. The next day he peeps at Annie while she is having her bath and leaves when her phone rings. Scott gets back home and sees Charlie with flowers. He tells him he knows everything about him and tells him not to come back to the house again. He goes to Annie and tells him it was Charlie who tries to kill him and also asks her if Mike came around the house, but she tells Scott he didn't, and he tells Annie to call the police anytime Charlie comes around the house again. He puts a call across to the police to get a restraining order against Charlie, but got a call from the police the next day telling him that Charlie has never stayed in the Royal Hotel, so they didn't see him to serve him the restraining order. He goes to Brian to ask him if he has heard from Mike, but he tells him he hasn't and asks him if he has any information about Charlie's family and was able to get the phone number of his daughter. While driving home, he calls the number and tries to talk about Charlie, but she drops the call when he mentioned Charlie's name on the phone. After calling her severally, she picks up and tells Scott that her father is a monster, and he killed her mother and made it look like suicide because she threatened to leave him and take away the house. She tells him that his life is in danger if he is in her father's way and ends the call. Annie gets back from the market and goes to the kitchen. Charlie shows up and scares her. He tells her that everything he did was for her and she asks him to leave the house, that they will talk about it later. As he leaves, she runs after him to lock the door and goes round the house to check if all the doors are locked and hears a sound. She goes up to the stairs and finds a door open and reaches out for a switch but can't find any and falls down as she walks in. She gets up, puts on the light, looks around and discovers that Charlie has been in the house all the while. She sees a ladder and climbs it. Charles sees her and goes after her. While running, she opens a door and sees Mike's body and gets scared. She climbs back into the house and attempts to call Scott, but Charlie shows up behind her and takes the phone from her. They struggle, but he overpowers her, hits her on the wall and she loses consciousness. Charlie takes her to the room to have sex with her, but she regains consciousness and struggles with him. Scott comes back to the house, and Charlie ties up Annie and covers her mouth to prevent her from screaming. He attacks Scott as he enters the room and throws him down from the top of the building. Annie unties herself and hides. Charlie shows up, and she hit him with a glass. He grabs and chokes her. Scott fight him off her, and Charlie holds him down and punches him severally. Annie stabs him with a knife, and he runs away. Charlie goes to get his gun, telling them he wants them out of his house, and shoots at them. They hide in one of the rooms as Charlie goes to look for them. Scott hits him with a baseball bat, and he falls down. Scott takes the gun and tells Annie to get her phone. Charlie tells him the gun is not loaded so he can't shoot him, but he tells him there is still one remaining and tells him to check his pocket. Annie comes back to the room, and Scott tells her to call 911. She puts a call across and tells the receiver that her husband just shot an intruder, and she tells him to pull the trigger, and Scott shoots and kills him.
Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.